One of the most creative and very powerful tool in Excel is called my pivot table. It's a separate entity that you can create up based on data. Typically, the data you use as the source for pivot table is something that is organized uh, like a list. Perhaps what we're seeing here on the screen, if you're trying to analyze this information, you have some tools available. Let me zoom in a bit. You have some tools on the data tab that you can use. Like sorting, filtering, you can use subtotals. But now most of them don't let you analyze the data so much, but at least allow you to view it in different ways. The list contains about, let's see, how much do we have here? It's 900 rows of data about salespeople who are selling different products to different customers in different regions. They're selling to different regions, and we are tracking information over a period of 2 years. You see various column headings here. Now, how do you make sense of this? On the data tab, there is certainly sorting, which you can use. This could certainly help if you want to focus on products in order or salesperson. Sorting, of course, gives us all kind of capabilities for seeing the data in a more organized way. But sorting does not have any real analytical capability. Filter can help. We can look at just the data we are most interested in for the moment. Subtotal can get you a bit closer, maybe to what we want might to be doing in terms of coming up with some analysis and base totals based on sorted list, maybe by region, by product, by customer, and so on. But trying to make sense of this in any other respect isn't so easy in Excel. Now, one way you can analyze this data is to write some formulas, and off to the right, the same thing is done. Let me zoom in a bit so you can see it clearly. How about now? Now we got a list of all the salespeople and the various items that we sell, and we're trying to figure out how many items each salesperson has sold. Now the table that you're looking at is not a pivot table, but we can create something like this by the way of pivot table in short order. Look at this, some of the formulas in here. They all look the same. If I double click on any one of it, you can see what's happening. If I double click here, you see what's happening. Over here, you see. Now most of these formulas, in fact, all of these formulas are entirely the same. Just a minor difference. And that difference is the key. Now, this is not an easiest formula to handle. I wouldn't call it a rocket science or anything like that, but a good experienced Excel user does spend a little bit of time on this, maybe take about 10 minutes or so, to not only get to the formulas down, but to ensure they are correct. If you're making a presentation of this information, how easy it would be to change the top row so we could focus on how many items each salesperson has sold to each customer. In other words, could we see customers at the top, salesperson by customer? This is salesperson by product. If I want to create another table by salesperson by customer, and let's imagine you are making a presentation, can you quickly make a switch on that easily? Well, if you're an analyst, you might say, well, I'll get back to you in about 10 minutes or so. I'll have that ready for you. With Pivot Table, we could create a list like this in maybe about 5 or 10 seconds. And we will be doing this momentarily. But we need to talk about what a pivot table is and how do we create it. And it's also about the source data. You can't just come up and say that, oh, I got some data. I heard so much about pivot table. Let's create a pivot table. It doesn't work like that. I'll just see what a pivot table can do. Now, the data that's going to be the source of your pivot table has to be organized like a list over here, like this. Now, possibly you could have converted it into a table, but that's not prerequisite, although it could be very helpful. Now, the list that we are looking here must not have any empty rows or empty columns. Your heading should be in single row. And it's generally a good advice for any list that you'll be working with in an Excel, and anytime you do sorting, filtering, or subtotal, or any data management feature, having your list organized like this makes a good sense. And if you're an interim subtotal in here, you need to get rid of those. Get rid of all the empty rows. And if you haven't seen this list in a while, click within it and then press Control A, Control Period a couple of times to ensure you're not losing out on any data. This will move you around the corners of the range when you get to the bottom if you haven't seen the list in a while. You can scroll down. You can scroll down as long as you're not clicking anywhere. And then continue pressing Control Period. It will take you to the back top. So we scoped out this list. If you work with your data often, you don't have to do that very often. Of course, you would know that this list is together as a unit. So what can we do next with Pivot Table? After pointing you to sort and filter and subtotals and reminding you of those capabilities, you certainly would think that a Pivot Table is on the same data tab over here. But that's not true. Pivot Table is not found on the data tab since it's a data management feature, but it's found on the Insert tab. Now there's a feature which we will look at perhaps later called recommended pivot tables, but let's just jump right into the idea that we would like to see a pivot table, and maybe what we would like to do is to create a pivot table looking like what we are seeing off to the right, salesperson by product by number of items. Quick look at this, by the way. The total is 7997, and you can see who is the best performer. Who is the star salesman? Put his name in the chat box. Who do you think is the star salesman? Name in the chat. And you're right, Varun Sharma is the star salesperson and sold about over 1,000 units. So we are expecting to see this list pretty soon. Now, of course, I need to talk about it as we do this, so it will take a bit longer than 10 seconds. So once we have organized the data in order, and by the way, you might have empty cells in there, and that's probably okay. Just make sure you don't have empty rows, empty columns in there. Rest everything goes. And we don't have empty cells in this data out there. Click on any cell within this data, then go to the Insert tab, and then click on the Pivot Table. Many times you simply click on that button and then click OK. The default location of Pivot Table is always a new worksheet. And that's what we are going to use for this time. Although if you want, you can create it on existing worksheet, but that's going to be very, very crowded. Usually you want to give a glance here as a table range. And Excel has figured out the extent of your data. It certainly has here, and it's saying I see data from A1 in the upper left hand corner down to cell H910 in the lower right, and we'll say okay, yeah, that's about right, and we will click OK, and boom. And we are about to see a new worksheet with a pivot table placeholder ready for us to create a pivot table. Placeholder over on the left side. On the right side, you will see a dialog box, a navigation pane, pivot table fields. That might be docked or anchored to the right, and that's fine. You can leave it there. Done. I'll give you a minute to be on the same page. Everybody done? Just put your answer in the chat box if you are on the same page. If you wish, you can click and drag the title bar and drag it out here. You could possibly resize it. Now, you don't really have any rationale for doing this just yet, but as you work with pivot tables, sometimes it's handy to have this closer to the data. But you can move this around a little bit if you wish. If you want to go back to its docked position, simply double click and double click on it. It should go back. Otherwise, you can simply drag and drop it to the right pane, right side. There we are. And we see a top portion here, all of the field names we saw earlier. Now, all I have to do is get this pivot table is the first click salesperson. And two things are going to happen on the screen. Far left, we see list of our salespeople in alphabetical order. Down below on the pivot table field list, here in the section called rows, sometimes these are referred to as a row label over in the pivot table, which is for the moment has no numbers. We see the term row. And over here we see row labels. Well, now I'm going to click the box for number of items. And we are tracking number of items sold. That's a numeric field, and that will automatically appear in the pivot table. And we'll see off to the left and also below here in the section called values. Boom. And then you see who is our best salesman. Again, Varun Sharma, right here. Third thing we need to do is simply drag whatever field we want into the column area. And so if we want to see products, we will drag products into the column area. Just simply drag and drop. And if I go back to the actual worksheet where we started creating worksheet or creating pivot, we see off to the right, ultimately the same numbers. Of course, you're not going to remember them all, but let's take an example of Silky Puri. Our total is 745. Let's go here. Silky Puri, 745. And other numbers are accurate too. We've got a pivot table, and I think you could have imagined that happening here even faster had I not been explaining and talking about it along the way. Easy to get to. We got a pivot table, and need I mention these long formulas that we saw earlier? You saw these formulas? And if we go back to pivot table, there isn't any formula at all. No formula inside. Not only no formulas here, but no formulas along the grand totals. Pivot table has done all this calculation in the background. Everything happening in the background. These are just the numbers. One suggestion I usually make with pivot table, and what I usually do myself when I create a pivot table, the term column labels and row labels, although valuable, and those are the terms you might want to get to familiar with, don't necessarily need to be here. But let me point out as we look at the pivot table field list to the right, and I'm going to move the upper part this way so we can see a little bit better. Over here we see row labels and column labels. It reminds us the layout of the pivot table, and the box is rows and pivot table itself. If we want to see row labels, rows or row labels are down on the left side here. These are referred to row areas and sometimes row labels area in the pivot table. Across the top here are the column labels that correspond with what we see in the pivot table field list in the lower right, which is columns. So rows and columns, row labels and column labels. And here in the section called values area, if you're working with your data and you are a data analyst, you're looking at these numbers, considering some other layout. Maybe certainly it's not going to bother you to see this. And even in the some presentation values, that's not bad either. But I think most of us would probably rather see either nothing here or actual field label that we see. In other words, salesperson and product. Now, there is something else that you might have considered or recognized. Not only do we have this pivot table field list to the right, we've got a new ribbon in the menu system called Pivot Table Analyze and Design tab. Now, these are related to pivot table. If you click outside, they will go away. They'll disappear. Now, clicking back within the pivot table, the pivot table field list reappears on the right, and also we have two contextual tabs right at the top here. If you don't want to see the terms right here, over here, row labels, column labels, one option, or this field header or the field list, one option is click on the Analyze tab, and in the Show, click on Field List. This will go away. Field headers, if you click on that, they will also go away. And I think you could make a sense of saying, well, they don't really need to be here. We know these are products. We know these are salesperson. Why do we need this? So maybe we need nothing. I think better approach is we bring them back and then go to the Design tab. And this is certainly not an obvious choice, at least first time around. But if you get to the report layout, you'll see, and this, of course, would not be obvious either. We are currently viewing the pivot table in what is called as compact form. The other two forms are outline and tabular. Actually give us the field headings in the place in irrespective of those terms. If I click on this outline form, keep an eye on this screen. Now I've got salesperson and product. The row labels and column labels, outline and tabular, are very similar. If I go to tabular, I still have those. Apart from difference, the difference is, and you might have already noticed, put your answer in the chat box. What difference do you see in the chat box now between tabular form and outline form? What do you see? Put your answer in the chat box, and I'm going to put the correct answer here. What difference did you observe? Yep, that is correct. So we don't have grid lines in outline, and we see those grid lines in tabular. There is another difference that we might see later. Tabular form, there we go, we see grid lines. Outline without, more important. I think a lot of people, salesperson and product, and particularly if you were printing this, I think you would like to see that on the worksheet and making a presentation as well. Now in this look, keep in mind, standard Excel features are pretty much available too. We can go to the Home tab, and we can maybe want to color it, change the colors, fill bucket, make it bold, italic, underline. We can certainly do that. I just want to make undo this. We could also angle the text if we want. Let's say like this. Let's reset it. Now, these are not critical items, but we could do that if required. We've got good solid information here, and as you will see in upcoming chapter, we have the ability to quickly manipulate this data and display it in different ways. It doesn't take long to create a pivot table. So let's do a quick recap. Going back to the source data, here we are. On creating pivot, first of all, make sure our data was contiguous, row after row, no empty column. We clicked within the pivot table, went to the insert tab, clicked on pivot table icon, and from there we simply clicked OK, and we ended up in a new sheet over here, sheet number 8. Remember, initially we didn't see anything on the left side, but then pivot table field list to the right, and we clicked in the box, and we bring this back and put the salesperson in the rows, products in the column, and values in the number of items in the values. Fast, easy, and some pretty impressive analysis at your fingertips. Clear? Question? So if you have a question, put your question in the chat box. We are looking at a pivot table on the worksheet called manipulating. This is in our file pivots. I've shared the link in the chat for this file. Feel free to download this file. This is identical to the pivot table you might have seen created in the previous chapter. As we look at the field list on the right side, remember, the pivot table list is typically anchored or docked. You can drag it out here. Sometimes this is handy because you want it closer to the data, and other times you might want to drop it to the right side, and you can do it on the left side either. We can change the size of the top and bottom when needed to. Keep in mind the lower portion of this is like a map of pivot table. And as you get more familiar with the concept of rows and columns area and the values area, and you're working with the pivot table, you see the relationship here. Let's imagine we are having a sales meeting. And we've been talking about the numbers here, particularly the highest high, lowest low. And that discussion has pretty much run its course. And maybe we would like to see a breakout instead of product by salespeople. How much about customers by salesperson? So we can remove product from columns and bring the sale customer in the columns. Now we are seeing how our customers are doing. In that way, simply by dragging and dropping, we can see what is happening with our salesperson with customer, which customer is buying more, which customer is buying less, which salesperson is selling to which customer. And now we have a breakout by salesperson by customer. Same grand total, same total numbers in all the areas. We are only talking about customers. In all the field list, you can imagine a lot of potential here. And what we might be comparing, another person might say, let's not show the salespeople. Could we see this breakout by customer and region? Are the customers doing better, or customers are buying more in one region or another? Let's uncheck the box for salespeople. Then instead of dragging the region, what I can certainly do, I'll simply going to check the box of region. And anytime you check a box for a text field, it will automatically appear in the row labels. And that will be down the left hand side. And so there we see the breakout. Now somebody in your audience has pointed out, we saw this list like a couple of years ago, and I remember I prepared that manually. And it took me a while, and we had customers' name down on the left side and the regions right across the top. So he means regions here and customers here. Can we do that? The word pivot, we typically don't really use as we talk about pivot tables. But here's the where the word actually comes from. Imagine this list right here. If we could pivot this from upper left hand corner to lower left hand or diagonal from left to lower right, we could somehow twist this and then put these words down to the left hand side in the column way and then across the row. Oh, like this. And also in pivot table field, we are going to switch the customer by region and in no particular order. So we simply dragged customer down in the rows area and the region at the top in the column area. And the entire view has some magic possibilities sometimes. And now I'm going to drag, this is how the region into the columns that we dragged. Now we pivoted the data, and as you manipulate the data, sometimes the layouts are going to be not so attractive. Keep in mind, if you don't like it, you can anytime undo that or redo it. If this is your data, you probably have some instinct about what you're looking for, and although there are many interrelationships that we might want to explore here, sometimes you're not always sure, and it's just good idea, and you quickly get over any timidly that you might have about moving these fields back and forth. Mm, is this better? Is this better? I think this is better. And at all the times, remember, anytime you do anything in pivot table, you're not harming the source data. And there's always a sense of freedom that you can do, anything could mess up. You can mess up the pivot table. It could look awful. That's possible. But you're not in any way. But you are not damaging or altering the source data, or you're threatening the original source data. Now we can have two fields in rows areas and columns area, much more likely in the rows. Maybe now we would like to see some relationship between customer and region and product. So let's bring region into the rows area, and we already have that. And let's bring product into the over here. And how about this one? Maybe this. So you are pivoting it. You're seeing the same in different views. How about we want to see customer here and product here? Maybe product here and region there. Maybe customer there and product here. Maybe how about this one? Now, why would you do that? Maybe because of presentation purpose. Maybe you want to analyze this data much more clearly and easily. So you might want to do that. And if you're simply analyzing the data, you're not overwhelming yourself. Keep in mind, there are audience, of course, who don't want to see so much information. And suddenly, at different times, you want to be thinking about those crowded pivot table is, how crowded the pivot table is. And as I click back in the pivot table, recognize what we are seeing here for the first time. We've got two rows in the rows area. Customers on the top, region at the top, or maybe you want customers at the top. You can pivot any which way that you want. Sometimes you want them, sometimes you don't. And if you don't want them, you may drag it out, drag it back in. Notice over here, we have grand total. We don't have subtotals. Maybe you want interim subtotals. So if you don't have subtotals and maybe you want to see the subtotals, let's go to the design tab. And the far left, we have subtotals. Click on that. Maybe you want to see subtotals at the bottom of the group over here. Now we have a subtotal, interim subtotals. Makes sense. So we have customer by region. Which customer is buying what products in what region? What is the total? We can see that. Like this, you can do an analysis there. Okay, yeah, this designer home is not buying glass center table too much. We need to push him. And we have an option in subtotals to see the subtotals at the bottom that we see here or at the top. If you click on the top, what happened? What do you see? Let's click on the top again. Nothing happened. If I click on don't show subtotals, it will go away. But if I click on top of the group, it doesn't come. It comes at the bottom. I didn't click at the bottom. I click at the top, but it will show me at the bottom. Why is this happening? Did we do something wrong? Let's take a look at the different report layout. I'm going to put it in outline form now. Keep an eye on the pivot table. Oh, we got the subtotals at the top here. Very slick, right? So what's wrong with if I change the layout to tabular form? That's going to be a problem. We don't have subtotals at the top. We have subtotals at the bottom. If I change it to outline, now it's at the top. Yes, because in the outline and tabular form, other than the difference of grid lines, there is one more difference that you cannot have subtotals at the top of the group. In the tabular form, you cannot have subtotals at the top. You can only have subtotals at the bottom. And that's the difference. Apart from that, if we go back to subtotals, you have an option to not show the subtotal. It will just go away. Let's say if we have at the top of the group, although it will come at the bottom, it doesn't make any sense. So, and we have the option in the report layout to repeat all item labels. And how does it work? These are the item labels. Let's see. And over here, we see all the item labels here. Why do we need that? I have no clue. Maybe you want to don't choose the subtotals. I leave it up to you to decide whether you like it, you want it, you don't want it. You decide. But there's a choice, there's an option. Do not repeat labels. I like it this way. Then you have an option here to insert a blank row. You can insert a blank row after each item, maybe give you a much cleaner look. After every item, you will have a blank row. Of course, the problem here is you get to see more number of rows here. Now I have data spread across 40 rows. If I change it, I'll get to see 35 rows. So 5 more rows, and depending on how large is your data, you can have several rows out there. And I leave it up to you. The benefit is you get to see much a cleaner look of your data, but there's a downside too. I tend to keep it this way. Then you have style options. Some style options are there, row headers, and if you uncheck it, it will just unhighlight it. You see? And same goes with column headers. Now we have an option here called banded rows. If you have attended the chapter of our training for tables, we know you would know what banded rows and banded columns can do. I'm going to click on banded rows and you see what is happening here. At the same time, you can click on banded columns. Too much, overcrowded. How about this? Maybe this. So I leave it up to you to decide what you want. And in the styles group, you got tons of choices here. Maybe which one do you want to use? How about this? Maybe this. We have different color options to pick and choose from. Maybe dark color, medium color, light color. And if you're not happy, you can create your own pivot table style. Too much. Maybe you want this, maybe not. And these colors depend on which theme you are using. So let's say if I go back to page layout and I can change the theme here. How about this one? Now I'll go back here in the design. I may have different color options, choices here. Maybe a different theme will work. Maybe I want Wisp. I've got different colors here. So you got tons of choices to pick and choose from. I'll not spend much time on this coloring because it's just a waste of time. But I suggest you spend some time, pick up your favorites out here. Which one you like, which one you don't. Pick up your favorites. And when you're done, just pick up the color here and you should be all good. I'm gonna undo this. There we go. Now, another thing which I want to tell you about the pivot table is, let's go back here and I'm going to change this to product and salesperson. Now we are on the same data out there. Let's go to the raw data here. And I'm going to remove some of these columns here so we can see the table right next to it. And unzoom a bit so we can see it clearly. So let's say we have Varun Sharma who sold glass center table Northeast Metro Emporium. How much he sold? 4. And Varun Sharma total glass center table, how much he sold? 200. Now let's say if I change it from 4 to 5, this 200 will become 201, right? Yes or no? See that in action? I'm going to change it to 5 and press enter. It became 201. And the same should reflect in the pivot table. So I'm going to go back to pivot table. And here it says Varun Sharma glass center table. How much does it say? 200. Why? Shouldn't it say 201? Can any one of you tell me why this is happening in the chat box? It is 201 and it shows here 201, but if I go back to pivot table, it still says 200. There is absolutely something wrong here, right? Yes or no? No, there's nothing wrong here because this is as per design. And I told you moments ago that your raw data and your pivot table, they are not connected to each other. There is no direct connection, right? There is no direct connection. So, but you might argue with me that, okay, we created this pivot table based on this raw data. We pulled this data, we went to this raw data, and we then clicked on create a pivot table, and then it created a pivot table with this data. And now you are saying they're not connected. Are you serious? So yes, this is absolutely true. These raw data and I'm going to explain you with some diagrams here. So what happens is, let's say we have this raw data. This is our raw data. And let's say we created this pivot table. Now when we create a pivot table, raw data will create a temporary file on your computer. Let's call this a temp. It's a secured file. It's stored at the secured location. It's a file on your computer. And with this file, it will then create a pivot table for you. And it's a one-way street. You can always send information from here to here. You cannot send information from here to here. There is no connection. This information flow will not happen. It's a one-way. Which means that if you change anything in the data, if there is any change in the raw file, any change, so this is an example of change, diagram for change. So if you change something in raw data, your pivot table will not impact. And you can do whatever in the pivot table, anything you want. Anything with your keyboard and mouse you want to do in pivot table, please feel free to do it. Damage it as much as you can. You will not be damaging your raw file. It's absolutely safe. But we were talking about getting the updated data. That's okay, we know that this is safe. So if we make any change in here, we need to first send this change to temporary file. Of course, it will go to the temporary file. And then we need to take the new data from temporary file, which is stored on the computer, which means that we need to refresh the pivot table to get the latest information. And I'm going to click on refresh. Keep an eye here. I go to in home tab or analyze tab, and here we have an option refresh. And as soon as I do that, you would see this number would change into 201. Let me see, why is this? This is not created from there, from a different file. And here we go. Here it is. Now it says 201. So we created this file from there. Clear? Any question so far? And now if we want to make changes again, I go back to creating pivot and I go to the very top here. I change it to 4. Keep an eye here, it will change automatically 200. But if I go to this sheet, it will not change until I refresh. I go to design tab. So I go to the design tab and I refresh it. And it says 200 now. Clear? Question? So we have seen a lot of different ways of manipulating the data, gotten the familiarity with the refresh concept. Let's take another look at the drill down method. Now over here, the drill down method says that, okay, we have, let's say, Birbal Bajaj. Now we want to see here which customer he sold to. So what we can do, we can double click on Birbal Bajaj, and over here we have a show detail. And over here I can select customer, and it will pull up the detail of all the customers where this data is coming from. And I want to see Metro Emporium, which region it is. So I can click on double click and click on region. It will say Southeast. Oh, and what date he sold it to? And we got all the dates. So this method is called a drill down method. So we are drilling the data down. And if you want to come back here, if I go to the field list, you would see all those items here. And I can remove them to see my original data back. Let's take a look at another concept in the pivot table. Let's say we are looking at the information of Birbal Bajaj. And let's imagine he sold maybe 110 marble dining table. And you're not sure about it. And you're saying, Birbal sold 110 marble dining table. When did that happen? I don't know. I don't remember that Birbal selling these many items. And maybe you would like to see the details of all those 110 items, marble dining table, that Birbal has sold. Particularly, Birbal has sold all the marble dining tables and where this number is coming from. And you can simply double click on this and Excel will create a new sheet to the left of current sheet and it will show you all the details where Birbal has sold marble dining tables on which date and to which customer. It will show you all the details and it's a snapshot of the data. Where it is coming from, the temporary file. It is not connected to your creating pivot. So you are looking here at the snapshot of data in time. And we can, when you see that, okay, yeah, that's seems about right, and you can probably delete it. If you make any changes in the snapshot of the time file, nothing will happen to the pivot table because it's just a snapshot. So we are looking at the pivot table on the worksheet called date grouping or date group. It's based on the data in the creating sheet workbook. And if you saw the previous manipulating, how we did that, how we connected or created the pivot table, you can recognize this data. And over here we have we can bring back the field list. It's the same pivot table. But this time we are showing here the dates here, or the months. We can call them dates. These are dates, so we can say them, these are dates. And now this data doesn't look very promising. More or less, pivot table seems to be compact and concise. This one certainly isn't. We are covering data for over 2-year period, and this just goes on and on and on. It's a bit shorter than the source data, not 900 rows, but it covers about 500 rows. It's a bit shorter than the source, but still not very compact. We would like to be able to group this data maybe by month or year or quarter, something like that. And all we really need to do is right click on these dates and then click on group. And over here we can select, maybe we want to group it by months, quarters and years. We can select all of those and we can click OK. And over here we can see, or maybe we want to group it by months and years, or year or months. Now we can see data by month here, and it's much more compact. Now we do recognize here we have in the rows, we now see months here. Now the problem here is this January contains a sales period, sales for 2 years, 2019 and 2020 January. So these are both these Januaries. Now we want to be able to group it further. If we right click again and click on group, we can click on years. We click on year. Now we have 2019 and 2020 by year. Now we want to see by month as well. Group, and we can select month. We don't need to press the control key. And over here, now we see year-wise, month-wise data. And this is much shorter rows here. Now we see only 30 rows instead of 900. And maybe we want to see an apple-to-apple comparison like this. And these subtotals I don't need to see, so we can turn them off. And we can see what's happening. Maybe somebody in your organization may say, okay, can we see a quarter-to-quarter comparison? Of course we can. We can simply bring quarters back. And then we don't need months here, because if we have quarter, we can see quarter to quarter. And how about this one, last quarter to this quarter? And much more compact data. It is very compact now. It is showing breakout by quarter and year and then a region. This might be all we need to see here. And now notice in the Pivot Table field list, in the rows, we have the word here quarters and years. Now maybe you want to see the months. You know how to do that. You can simply right click, group, and maybe you want to bring back the months. You can do that, and like this. Now over here, maybe your organization, and if you want to bring back the data, you think that data is gone. No, you can ungroup it. You're back to where you were. Absolutely no damage. So if, let's say, your organization follows a linearity and they have sales from one date, let's say to 10th of every month to, or 15th of every month to 15 for 15 days linearity. So you can select a 15-day period. You can type a 15 here and then click OK. And now all the dates are grouped into 15 days. You can see. And you might say, my 15 days doesn't start on 6th. They start on 1st to 15th. So we can do a grouping from 15th because, or 1st January 2019. And we can say, okay. So we have 1st January 01, and we have a 15-day cycle. And click OK. Now we have 1st to 15, 16 to 30. And then we have at the bottom, we have 21 to every 15 days, we have a cycle here. So these slabs we have created based on our terms and conditions. So, and we are not doing any kind of damage. And sometimes this is more advantageous to see, have more compact view. So we can see what's happening here. And over here, if we want to start it, if you want to come back, simply right click and ungroup. And you're back to where you were. You're not doing any kind of a damage to your data. Your data is still intact as it is, as it was. Group. And you can do the same thing with, if you have time in there, you can do with days, hours, seconds, minutes. You got way too many choices out there. And you can certainly do that. So be wary of that. The source data has to be accurate. In other words, all dates in your source data has to be valid. If you got something like November 31st or April 31st, a day that doesn't exist in your data, then you gotta have a problem here. So correct the dates if you run into problems. Otherwise, I think you can see what a great feature it is. question in the chat. Any question you have? In addition to grouping data by date in Pivot Table, you can also come up with your own groupings. We are looking at a worksheet called Other Grouping in our workbook Pivots. Now we got some data here, and we got a region broken out. We got Northeast, Northwest, Southeast, Southwest. And someone asking us, can you come up with a total for the East? Can we see in the Pivot Table? Well, we don't really have an Eastern region. We have Northeast and Southeast. First of all, let's put them together, and I'm going to drag it and put it together, Northeast, Southeast. Now we don't need to highlight this data, and if we want to move it to the next Northeast, we can do simply select it and move it, drag to the edge and move it. And the numbers, all the numbers will move as it is. And now they're adjacent to each other. Now what we want to do is we can simply select both of them, right click and group. And we have a group one here. I'm gonna remove it outside. Sorry. Remove the region out. Now I have a group one, and we can rename it to East. And I can do the same thing here. Group. I can name it to West. So we are seeing essentially a new data. Now it's based on our source data, and of course these are totals are the same as 4 totals as we saw earlier. At least they add up to be the same. But we now have this ability to expand and collapse as we wish. And we got a new name here, region 2. And that's not exactly very self-explanatory and can immediately come up with a great name here. And East and West, that makes sense. Now, when you're ready, you can see different views out there. You don't have this kind of availability in the pivot table. And if you're not aware, you might go to the pivot table and create a new region based on Northeast and Southeast and Eastern region. But you can do certainly in the pivot table. And if you think you have damaged this and how to bring it back, right click, ungroup. Your data is intact as it is where it was. Here it is. You're not doing any damage to it. I'm gonna redo it or undo it. And let's say your manager says, okay, there are glass center table, marble dining table, wooden coffee table. I just want to see all the tables together. Select all of them, right click, group. And now we have group 1. We can collapse it, or we can rename it to product. We can remove product out and we can name it as all tables. And we can rename this to all couches, all sofa and couch. And we can see the number remains the same. Excel will automatically do the calculation. And we are seeing those breakouts there. And our data is intact. We have not damaged anything. So you got flexibility with this. And you could use the same kind of feature on rows or columns. And if you have people names down there, let's see if I bring the salesperson out there. And if I move them out, and over here, we see, let's ungroup these. Now we have this data out there. Let me zoom in a bit. And this data doesn't look is right, but it's very confusing out there. And we can obviously make it in an order. Of course, we can move Varun Sharma to the top here. He is our top salesman. Then we can move Gunjan. How about Silky? And then we have Anup Sinha. Simply drag to the edge. And then we have Southeast. Or we have Northwest. So we can move Northwest here. And over here we have Dev Malik. Then we have Birbal Bajaj and Shipra Kale. Now this adjustment, now our salespeople region-wise data look much more organized and meaningful, and it's easy to imagine how we can do it. While simply dragging it and bringing them together. And if all these three people are working in the same office, we can simply right-click and group them. Maybe we can call it Delhi office. We can call them Lucknow office. We can call them Mumbai office. We can call them Chennai office. Now, if we say we have created these offices here, and we don't have Delhi office or Lucknow office, Mumbai office in our raw data. They just don't exist. But we can do all these in our terms and conditions. So you have the ability not only with the data as we saw previously, but any kind of data, you can group it on your terms and conditions. And remember, a confidence booster for you, you're not damaging your data. Your data is still intact. Anytime you think you make a mess, simply start a fresh one. Let's take a look at this pivot chart here. You may be familiar with how to create charts, and we covered an extensively an entire day on charts. It could be financial chart, it could be personal chart, it could be days chart, date chart, month chart. We did that already. With pivot tables, we also have the ability to create charts. Now, these are called pivot charts. And they're a little bit different, but pretty much the same general idea. Now, might not have a pivot table available for this data out there. So I'm going to create one. But notice, if I go to the Insert tab, not near the pivot table to the left, but the way over under charts, I got pivot chart. Use pivot chart to graphically summarize data and explore complicated data. Let's create a pivot chart. Now you get a pivot table at the same time. Now we could put this on the same worksheet or on a different worksheet. We'll just put it on the new worksheet. How about a new worksheet? We'll simply click OK. Now what's a little bit different here is the pivot chart fields list, first of all, doesn't say pivot table field list. It says pivot chart fields. Instead of seeing rows and columns area, we see axes and legends here. But think of these as rows and columns. So I'm going to click the box of salesperson and number of items. And you see my chart is building up. And I can bring the products in the legends. And here we go. I'm not building a pivot chart. I'm just building a pivot table. Now, my chart is an outcome of pivot table. So I've got a pivot chart here. And pivot chart is always in sync with your pivot table. You make any changes there, your pivot chart automatically updates. How about this? How about a region? How about this? So you don't focus on creating a chart, you focus on creating a pivot table, and your chart is the end result. There it is. And maybe a product wise. And you have all the same general idea here. You got a pivot table and a pivot chart together at the same time. You don't need to refresh anything, don't worry about it. Any changes in the pivot table happens in the chart automatically. If I were to pivot this, you keep an eye on the chart. Here it is. Updates happen automatically, real time. Now, what if we didn't create a pivot chart from the beginning? If I go back to my initial sheet here, or this sheet, what if I don't have a pivot chart now? How do I do it? Do I need to create a pivot table, pivot chart, and again? No. Remember the shortcut for a pivot chart, or simply a chart? It's the same one. Alt F1. Click in the data, press Alt F1. You get a pivot chart. There it is. You get a pivot chart here. Automatically, you'll get a pivot chart. I'm gonna ungroup it. Here it is. Lucknow office. I'm gonna ungroup. Here it is. My chart is simply just the out. And if I click on the chart, you get the pivot chart field. If I click on the pivot table, I get pivot table field. Notice when you click on the chart, you get additional tab of formatting. I'm going to go back in pivot chart here. Here is the format tab. And you can format this chart in whatever way you want. You got some effects here. We covered that extensively. I'm not going to spend time on this one. So you have all the options out there. You have a pivot chart. Click in the table, you got tables here. Chart, you got a chart. There is absolutely no difference other than just read these as row and columns. So pivot chart, remember, you can create anytime. And if you don't want that, you can simply delete it. You're back to pivot table. You want the pivot chart back? Alt F1. You got a pivot chart. Anytime. It's just the chart. Delete it, you get a pivot table. Alt F1, you get a pivot chart. Additional tab, format tab, all related to chart. Click on the chart. In the design, you have an option here to change some of the chart items, chart element, change the chart type. You get all the options out there. How about this one, number 12? You can create a chart here. Very easy. Same features for the chart are available here in the pivot chart. No difference at all. So pivot chart, remember, you can create it at any time by simply clicking in the data and pressing Alt F1. Or before you are creating a chart and table together, you can go to the Insert tab and click on Pivot Chart over here. You can simply choose Pivot Chart. It will create a pivot chart here. All right, so thank you very much and for joining in for this pivot chart. I hope this helps a lot, provide much more clarification on pivots. Thank you and have a great rest of the weekend. Bye-bye.